Welcome to the Oklahoma Memo Podcast. My name is Ryan Welton, the founder and curator of your daily local news recap. Oklahoma Memo hits your inbox Monday through Saturday at 7 a.m. You can sign up at oklahomamemo.com/subscribe. And this is our weekly conversation with Grant Hermes of the Make It Make Sense podcast with Grant Hermes. How are you doing, Grant?
I'm good, Ryan. How are you, man?
Doing good. It's been a crazy week. Before we get started, though, I want to remind folks how to find Grant. I always look up the term Mims Pod, MIMS Pod. OU fans, we remember Marvin Mims. So it's easy. If you're a Sooner, Mims Pod, make it make sense. He's on Grant, that is, not Marvin Mims. He might have a Substack, I don't know, but Grant has one. He has one he's got a Substack, he's got a YouTube, he's got a podcast, wherever you get those podcasts. And you've had a lot of interesting conversations this week. But I wanted to start, I feel like we're in a good sort of cadence here by starting with what's happening in Oklahoma. And this week, that news has gone national. Governor Kevin Stitt finds himself as in the crosshairs of President Trump because of his role with the National Governors Association. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Kevin Stitt is the chair, so the head of the National Governors Association. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's the association where all the governors from every single state come together to talk about state-level issues, how they're running their states, how states are doing things well, not well. It's how states sort of talk to one another, how these leaders talk to one another. It's a pretty important organization when it comes to American politics. And every year, the NGA has a meeting at the White House with the president. Last year, when this happened, there was a back and forth with the governor of Maine, where Trump threatened to send ICE and troops to, and she said, come get it, basically, taking him on. And then this year, the president decided to not invite, at least right away, Democratic governors from across the country. Not every single one, but quite a few, including the vice chair of the National Governors Association, Governor Wes Moore from Maryland. Almost all of the governors he did not invite were all governors of color, which I think is important to point out. Governor Wes Moore is a man of color, also a veteran, too. So there's some of those things as well, where Trump doesn't always like to be in the room with veterans. That's his own sort of picadillo thing he's got. But Kevin Stitt came out and said that this is wrong, that the governors of the states represent the people in those states, whether they voted for Trump or not, whether the state was blue in 2024 or not. They want to meet with the president because they have their own individual asks. They have their own individual ongoing things that happen with the administration. Certainly, the administration is doing this in a lot of states right now when it comes to DHS and quite a few detention centers, kind of like the one that we talked about last week in Oklahoma City. So there's a lot of reason for every governor to attend this meeting. Well, after Stitt comes out and says that, it kind of blows up in the news cycle for, let's say, 12 hours or so, maybe 12 to 24 hours, really. And the president decides to re-invite these people. He's still angry at Wes Moore, who I think Wes Moore swore one time while talking about Trump, and Trump was like, he's got a potty mouth, and I don't like that, which is like insane coming from this guy. But he invites everybody and says that actually Kevin Stitt was wrong, and he's a rhino, which means Republican in name only, which is not a real Republican. I think this was about the same time that Trump was telling other Republicans not to be panicans, is what he calls panicking Americans. It's not his best nickname for things. But he took a real aim at Kevin Stitt, who, apart from endorsing DeSantis in the last, primary, Kevin Stitt has been a pretty faithful Republican governor to Donald Trump since 2016 and going forward. So it was a real surprise that the president would take aim at Kevin Stitt and not just keep it focused on the governors, but also the president got caught in a lie and needed somebody to blame. And it was Kevin Stitt this time around. I think that, before we were rolling, you said a really interesting thing here that I think it's important to keep in mind when we think about Kevin Stitt, especially in the national stage, is that Stitt is a lame duck right now. He knows he can't run again, so he's got nothing to lose, really. And it seems like in this moment for Republicans like Stitt, and he may or may not have designs on a federal office. It doesn't really look like one of those will come up anytime soon for him. But really, his next move will likely be somewhere in the state politics space. And not just within Oklahoma. I mean, working with states across the country in some sort of nonprofit or foundation or think tank or whatever. And he knows that his political bread is buttered by keeping good relationships with these people from the NGA, from their staff, from the people that would he be able to network with these people. And not so much with the members of the Trump administration, which seems to be flying a little too close to the sun right now and doesn't really have its legs underneath it. The president seems to be grasping for the same kind of power grabs that he had during his first year as president, which have slowed down significantly, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute here too. But the president is lashing out, and Kevin Stitt was just the latest person to do it. It was just sort of striking to see that he would do this. The other thing too is that governors, as a group of people, as a group of politicians, tend to like other governors. It's all kind of like it's like the end of Heat, basically, right? Where like they meet each other, and it's like we both have our responsibilities. Like Republicans and Democrats as governors are kind of like that, where they're like, I don't agree with everything you're doing, but I get that you're running a state and I'm running a state, and that's not an easy job. And also, we're the executives of our states. We're the highest you can get in our states in a lot of ways. We outrule or overrule senators when it comes to things that happen to those constituents, to our voters, to our people. And so they tend to rally around one another when these things happen. And I would not be surprised if we see that happen when the NGA goes to the White House now that they're going to be, almost all of them are going to be there, because Trump basically just created a much more hostile environment for himself by going after Kevin Stitt. I think if he had only gone after Wes Moore, the vice chair, maybe Republican governors would have been a little more reluctant to show up hostile. But I think with Stitt being the guy that Trump took aim at, everyone is going to line up more than they would have before.
So let's look at this from the position of constitutionalists. Kevin Stitt is very much a states' rights guy. Amendment 10 that's his jam. President Trump, not so much. He is a nationalize this, nationalize that.
Yes. It has been an extremely expansive administration under Donald Trump this time around in a way that, when he campaigned, lots of things were about returning things to the states, and that just really hasn't been the case under this administration. And so I do think that on some level as well, in the way that I'm talking about governors as unique political creatures, the idea of controlling your state is really important to them and has been really important to Stitt. This is not the first time that he's come out and said something about the Trump administration's overreach into states, overreach over what the Constitution says states have the right and the ability to do. I'm really curious to see if he'll say it around something like the election, with what we're seeing with the Department of Justice, what we're seeing with the SAVE Act, what we just recently saw in Fulton County, Georgia, with the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence being there, which is a whole other ball of wax. But it's not the first time that Kevin Stitt has stood up for what we consider to be federalism, which is a lowercase political science word, but it means the separation of state powers and federal powers. And it will be interesting to see if that comes up more, and it comes from Stitt at this, National Governors Association lunch with the president, for sure.
When does that lunch happen?
I believe it happens next week, but don't quote me on that. I don't have it locked down on my calendar yet.
So just one more question about this. As we think about Governor Stitt and his relations with the men who are running for governor now, this is also reflective of the relationship that he has with Gentner Drummond, especially.
Yes.
He doesn't, they no love lost there. And Gentner Drummond and Charles McCall and Chip Keating have all pledged their allegiance to President Trump. So but also, you and I talked last week about the mystery that shrouds Kevin Stitt's future once he leaves office. Will he represent a company, a nonprofit? There's part of me that thinks he ought to just shoot his shot and run for president.
I mean, it might be worth it. He would have to do a lot of work in the next 2 years to a year, basically, to raise his national profile. Yeah, he's a well-known guy among Republican politicos, but with the broader public, that's a tough sell for president, I think. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be a candidate who comes in and is the is the candidate that pushes back on the expansiveness of the Trump administration and whoever follows the president, because he cannot run for a third term no matter how many times he and the people around him want to say that they can, or they're going to continue selling 2028 merch, and they're going to try. They absolutely are going to try, but there is just no legal way that that works. That's a different conversation that you and I have had before. But like, uh, so Kevin Stitt jumps in and becomes kind of the Bernie Sanders of the Republican primary, maybe, and pushes members, pushes the rest of the candidates in that field running for president back into a space where they're forced to explain their abandonment of what used to be conservative thought about states' rights and individual liberties at the state level, and state control over certain policies, versus their fealty to Trumpism, which has taken over the Republican Party. That would be an interesting way for him to do it, and then he would sort of be that guy for a while. It's whether he wants to do that or not. That's I think that's a tough road to hoe. There's not a ton of money in that unless you can make the speaking circuit as a dude who does that, or like you write a book that sort of bucks the trend in this way. I mean, if he's going to run, look out for a book in the next 6-9 months or so. But like, yeah, maybe. And then I think when it comes to what's next too, it is this idea that he knows that whatever happens next, he needs a good relationship with the rest of these states. And if he's the guy who stood up to the White House, any White House, but this White House in particular, for the power of states to control themselves, that would make him at least it would make it easier for him to continue to work on states' levels.
I absolutely could see him as the guy who reminds the rest of the country that we are a loose association of states. That's what the
Yes.
United States is.
Yes, absolutely. And like it's, I don't know if Kevin Stitt is a dude who like thought the Articles of Confederation, which was our Constitution before the Constitution, was a better idea than the Constitution. I don't know how deeply he thinks about those things. I'm not sure he really does anymore. But like certainly there's a group of conservatives out there who are amiable to that idea. And Stitt, could easily push himself into that place. Yeah.
He talked about pushing back, and this is a segue into our next topic. When the history books are written, they will write about a great retreat that happened this week in Minnesota. It wasn't a roll down, a shut. It was a retreat, was it not? What happened in Minnesota? ISIS, they're leaving.
It absolutely is. I mean, Tom Homan has been there for 2 weeks, and this is the drawback that they said was going to happen, but it is rapid. And it is clearly unexpected for ICE because we know that they had been increasing the level of arms and ammunitions they were bringing into the state of Minnesota. They had like 35,000 different ammunitions and arms they had brought in. So they were clearly gearing up for a longer haul up until Tom Homan comes in, Kristi Noem, former Commander-at-Large Greg Bovino, Stephen Miller. They're all talking about how this is going to be a forever campaign, and they're going to get to 100 million deportations this year, which would be like just under a third of the American population, by the way. So let's be clear about what that would actually mean. But, this wasn't in their plan. And they were really hoping that Minnesota was going to be a place in which they could, sink their claws into and stay for a while to undo some of the embarrassment that had been Chicago, D.C., L.A., and Portland. And that just wasn't the case. If anything, it was worse than those places. And I think that certainly when people write about this moment in American history in the history books, it will be that Minnesotans, the people of Minneapolis, stood up to an incursion of federal forces who were killing people in the streets and pushed them out of their city and out of their state. It will be that the resolve of this thing was broken by an uprising of a community that isn't uniquely American. I want to be very clear about that, but is specifically American in the way that Americans think about themselves.
Mhm.
And the retreat also this week wasn't just from Minnesota, but quietly, the administration completely ended its National Guard deployments in Oregon, California, and Chicago and Illinois because they had lost in courts over and over and over again. The ice drawback in Minnesota is also due to that as well. They they clearly did not meet their quota for what they wanted to get done in Minnesota, but a judge almost at every turn was just like, none of this is legal. No, you can't do any of this stuff. And yes, there are people who are, going to say, and people in the comments and videos that I've done about this are going to say that, the law doesn't matter. Courts don't matter because this stuff happened anyway. And that's how courts work. Things happen, courts make rulings on them. Because courts exist, murders don't stop, shoplifting doesn't stop, thefts don't stop. But there is justice and punishment and consequences because those things have happened. And that's what courts are for. And we've seen that here in California, in Oregon, in Illinois, in Minnesota. We have seen it in other states as well. I mean, I'm fairly certain they are also going to be drawing back from New Orleans and Memphis fairly soon to try to sort of regroup and rally. It is not a full reordering or restructuring of what the White House wants to do, because like we talked about last week, having Tom Homan come in instead of Greg Bovino isn't a sea change in policy. Tom Homan is the same guy. He's just been around longer, knows how to strike these tones, knows what to say, and is a better look on air, on camera, and to journalists than Greg Bovino is. Homan is hostile, but not as hostile. Has been sent to turn the temperature, the perception of the temperature down. And that's what his role is. And that's clearly what's happening here with these drawbacks.
Bovino is straight a character out of one battle after another.
I mean,
He's joining the Christmas Adventurers Club.
he really is, man. And like, he also, there's been a couple stories out about this too, not to pick on Greg Bovino, but also like, sure. Greg Bovino became a Border Patrol agent after watching the Jack Nicklaus movie Border Patrol from like the 1980s, in which like that movie is actually about Nicklaus's character trying to like navigate the ethics of being a Border Patrol agent. And instead, Bovino, who was like a teenager at this point in time, walks out of that movie and is like, that guy got screwed, and I want to become a Border Patrol agent so that no one else gets screwed. And it was like, that wasn't the message of that movie, man. That's not what they were saying. And like, but like, yeah, so like he sort of turned himself into a movie villain, basically, in order to do this gig. And Tom Homan feels so much more steady at the wheel, and he's going to be much more competent at doing what the White House wants to do, because he's not Bovino, and he's been doing this for 30 years.
And just a quick segue to competency. This wasn't on our rundown here, but there was a big issue in El Paso this week where the Pentagon wanted to try these anti-drone things, and they never bothered to tell anybody.
Right. That is a really interesting thing that is actually part of a larger issue that we've seen with the Department of Defense. So, like, for listeners who don't really know what's happening here, you might have heard about what was going to be a 10-day full ground stop at the El Paso airport. And El Paso, right on the border of Texas and Mexico. And it was unexplained as to why this ground stop needed to happen. And at first, the administration said, well, we had drug cartel drone activity in the air and needed to keep people safe. And then, like, reporters in Texas were like, hey, what do you mean? Because we have access to, like, what's in the air. We have access to, like, flight trackers and those things, like, and drone trackers. What do you mean? And they're like, well, we had reports of drone activity from cartels, and we also wanted to try out this anti-drone technology we had. And they were like, so based on reports, and then the FAA was like, actually, there weren't really reports. There were like rumors of reports of drones from cartels, and the DoD used these drones equipped with lasers that are meant to take down other drones that have not been approved by the FAA because we don't know what they'll do to commercial aircraft. It is not the exact same thing. They're more powerful than this, but it's kind of like the lasers that people get arrested for shining them into the windshields of, airliners, blinding pilots. It's similar. It's not quite the same thing. These lasers are more powerful. They do some actual like damage. Not like, Star Wars lasers or anything, but like also in a way too, basically what the FAA says is that the DoD was like, we had this fun laser toy and we wanted to try it. And you kept telling us no because you hadn't given us approval yet. And like, that's not how things work. And yes, it is a level of incompetence. It's a level of overzealousness that is born out of incompetence or vice versa. Those things kind of go hand in hand frequently. But also it's this really interesting moment in which we just said to the world, and certainly to drug cartels coming out of Mexico and Latin America and South America, that if you want, you can shut down major U.S. airspace with a $200 drone. And that kind of a thing is the real incompetence here. That kind of a thing is the operational insecurity that we have been seeing come out of this Department of Defense under the leadership of Secretary Pete Hegseth, going all the way back to last year when he was using a encrypted, commercially encrypted, but like open source, basically, chat on Signal to describe missile strikes that later an internal review said that he did put troops in danger, put their lives in danger by doing this. And it's these are the only two things. We've seen these things happen before, coming out of the Department of Defense, and of the agencies in which you struggle with operational security, the DoD isn't one you want that happening to. And so this thing with the FAA and the DoD this week, while, bizarre and kind of funny because it's the DoD playing with a new toy, like it is also this other thing to keep an eye on because we're talking about real national security implications for what seems to be something that should have been fixed by a phone call.
It harkens back to when all of these appointees, cabinet secretaries, whatnot, were nominated, and the lack of any real rigorous feedback from Congress. The mindset with Congress has always been, well, President Trump is the president. He should be able to pick his own team. When in reality, isn't Congress supposed to play a much more rigorous role in vetting these people?
Yes, and for starters, like it's not just President Trump, it's every president. That the Senate generally is like, the president does get to pick his own team, and unless there are like massive glaring issues with one of the candidates or one of the nominees, then like generally we're going to let them through. That comes from a day and age in which you picked people who were, let's say for the DoD, former military members themselves, or they had worked in lower level intelligence or lower level in the DoD before. They were not Fox News hosts with, fairly low military ranks and a couple tours of duty. And not that like that's taking anything away from Hegseth's service to this country. I just mean that doesn't necessarily qualify him to run the Pentagon. And a lot of people were saying that. The thing that when we talk about, this sort of, how do I want to say this? This sort of cascade of incompetence, this sort of compounding incompetence that we're seeing out of the administration, whether it's from Hegseth, whether it's from Pam Bondi this week, whether it's from DHS and ICE also earlier this week, you're seeing that the Senate had to pick and choose who it was going to let through. Because the Senate, they could, but they don't. They can't just hold up every single nomination. I shouldn't say they can't. They just don't. And part of that is out of fear of retaliation for the next time a president happens. And what you don't want is gridlock every single time you get into president, that all you've got is these acting secretaries and attorneys general and surgeons general, and then, no one's accountable. So generally they pick and choose who they're going to block, who they're going to really question, who they're not. And they just ran out of people to do that to. They just did. And they spent quite a bit of their capital, not letting Matt Gaetz become attorney general, which gave them Pam Bondi. But there were just a lot of trade-offs that a lot of members had to make, and sometimes they're not all unified on those things. And so I think you're pointing back to a lack of pushback from the Senate on a lot of these nominees, now secretaries, is a good place to look.
We'll see what happens next time with the next president. Let's move on to the partial shutdown. Could it be a full shutdown? I've been confused this past week because I've heard a lot of talk about partial shutdown, but I haven't really seen a bunch of impact yet.
So it sounds like it's going to be a partial shutdown for sure. Members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, were set to leave for a 10-day break starting today, which is why they put this deadline for the shutdown stuff, for the funding fight here, so that it would force members to not give up their little, week-long hiatus. The deal right now, as it stands, is it sounds like there's not going to be any problem with continuing ICE operations, because ICE got its own separate stream of funding, about $75 billion in funding from the Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer. And that money, while technically separate from the Department of Homeland Security and DHS, pinky promise to keep it separate, it's basically impossible to keep that money separate. So, whether ICE is using or will be using actual DHS money, whether they can keep track of that if there's a government shutdown, is its own legal quagmire that will likely happen. But ICE will continue to operate on that money on paper. The rest of DHS, which is FEMA, which is the TSA, which is Coast Guard, they will likely shut down. A lot of those folks are essential workers for national security purposes, for health and safety purposes. FEMA does a lot more than just disaster relief. And those folks will have to go to work without pay. A lot of them won't go to work because they're not getting paid. A lot of them will be furloughed for a few days where they won't get paid at all. We are also talking about people who are still dealing with FEMA insurance loan money and being made whole after disasters, in which those claims aren't going to get processed. And that's just a few of these things, right? You'll see slowdowns at airports. You'll see slowdowns, delays in flights because of TSA, because of air traffic control, or some of that's not the FAA. But all those things are going to be impacted by this. And that's the partial shutdown. The rest of the government will remain funded because they already passed those bills. The last thing they're really trying to hammer out here is the DHS funding. And Democrats' demands are still the same. It is every officer, every ICE agent, every DHS agent needs to wear a body camera. Every DHS agent needs to be unmasked and has to identify themselves, which the president, said today or yesterday that that's a pretty tough sell because we got to keep these agents safe, except for there is not, according to DHS's own website, been a actual recorded instance of an actual doxing of an officer. So this idea that they have to keep their identities safe is a lie. And I understand the idea that somebody might, try to get their hands on where these officers live. And I understand that is frightening. But they are also public agents. And unfortunately, in this day and age, with access to the internet, that does come with a cost. And it's not right. And it is scary for these people and their families. I'm not taking that away from them, and I don't want to diminish that at all. There are, like I said before, there are consequences to doing that, to federal officers, to threatening federal officers. That's a real crime. And courts will deal with that after those things happen.
There was a minor hit song in the 80s. It was called The Politics of Dancing. It was by a band called Reflex. You're like, why is he bringing that up? Because now it's the politics of masking. And
Yeah.
let me take this back to Oklahoma. There was legislation filed this week that would prohibit protesters. There have been a lot of high school
Mhm.
protests. Most of them don't wear masks, not in high school. They're not really thinking of that. They're just exercising their right to speak out. But there's this bill now that would not allow protesters to mask, but absolutely would let authority to mask. And they cited this supposed risk of doxing and threat against families that doesn't exist.
Well, and what's to say in that same logic that it couldn't be turned around and used against high school protesters, right? Everyone's access to everyone else's face is the same. And so just because you're officer of the law or a federal agent uh, in the line of duty, why would that give you any more priority to secrecy of your identity? And I understand that in the logic of this, then just everybody wears a mask. We don't know who anybody is, and it's vigilantism in the streets. Arguably, it already kind of was in Minneapolis and in other places. So, I mean, I guess maybe. But also the idea, the laws that have been passed from the country, certainly after the George Floyd protests in 2020 about banning masks for protesters, those were mostly struck down at the court levels because they're against the First Amendment, against your right to peacefully assemble and your right to freedom of expression, which also means to not express yourself, which would mean to hide your face. And again, there are certain things that, certain arguments that could be had about wouldn't those things go for federal officers as well? And the answer generally has been no, that courts and the American public like when they know who is allowed to carry a gun to keep them safe, ostensibly, right? Who took an oath to keep them safe. Generally, we know who those people are. And that's what Democrats want here. They also want certain things which go along with this, like having actual uniforms. If nothing else than just like uniform blazers that say ICE or ERO on the back. You're not allowed to wear Chucks and jeans and a Carhartt quarter zip in someone's neighborhood to then claim you are ICE. That is again, people like knowing who's a cop and who's not, because ostensibly they signed up to protect people. And if you're a helper and we're looking for helpers, we need to know what you look like. If you look like a guy in a grocery store, I'm not going to, totally know if you're a helper or if you're not, or if you're just a dude wearing a mask and a gun. And that's really hard. And I mean, it shouldn't be hard because we demand these things of law enforcement across the board, but it's hard right now. It's a hard sell to Republicans, and there are a few other things too, but those are the real big ones right now.
There was a heartbreaking story in Oklahoma Watch about a Chinese national who was here legally, absolutely legally. He had an asylum meeting, but during the snowstorm that we had a couple weeks ago, he rolled his car. It was an accident, and he called 911. This is in far eastern Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol showed up. They have uniforms, but the Oklahoma Highway Patrol went into ice mode, and they arrested him, and they took him to jail. And so even sometimes with the unit, you want to know, but we should differentiate. We should not have Oklahoma Highway Patrol doing the job of a federal agency.
Well, and generally, like it is odd that that's how some law enforcement are behaving around the country, because generally what happens is, you're taken into custody by local law enforcement. They take you in and hold you for a minute, and then if they figure out who you are, and then they call ICE, and ICE comes to pick you up from the jail. Or a lot of places, what will happen is you'll be, in the tank overnight, and then they'll let you out the front door, and hey, there's an ICE agent waiting for you outside. So like technically they didn't hand you over, but they knew when Mr. Ice got here, and then they opened the door. So there's that. A lot of that was happening in Minnesota, even though the White House was, trying to say that they were not being notified when people who were on their list were being released, and that just ended up being a lie. They always had access to these people. They just refused to go pick them up instead because they were running around on the streets of Minneapolis. But like, it is a And that's a hard place for a lot of state law enforcement to be in, is to, how much of our, as state level law enforcement, of our authority do we give over to a federal law enforcement agency? Again, this is the federalism stuff we were talking about before, because if something goes wrong, it's still our fault. It like that story, and I read that story. It was interesting that they didn't take him into custody from the hospital. There's lots of other procedures that generally would have happened here and didn't happen, and so that's its own case. And each of these things will have those little differences here. But I think you're right in saying that the bigger conversation is, just how much leeway are state level agencies willing to give, and how much of their, like I said, own authority are they willing to give over to the federal government to do these things. That, I think, the more we see ISIS tactics, the more we learn about what happened in places like Minnesota, in Chicago, where there's new video out about the shooting that happened there that nearly killed a woman, who they then charged her with attempting to kill ICE officers, which on tape clearly doesn't happen. And then as well as in Portland this week, there's a new video out where the ICE agents, and I can't remember if the National Guard was there for this either, but they had said that rioters had broken a window at a federal building, and that's why they reacted violently. And on camera, it turns out it's a federal agent who broke the window to then give license to reacting violently on these protesters. So I think the discussions about how much state agencies are willing to do is going to be in the forefront in a lot of these places, especially as the Trump administration reorients about where they want to go, what they want to do next with ICE. Because if ICE is going to behave this way, a lot of federal or a lot of state agencies aren't going to want to be wrapped up in that.
It reminds me, though, the fear for me is that you have all of these folks who are here legally. Maybe they are undocumented, but when there's an emergency, they're going to be fearful of 911. And that reminds me of another 80s song. 911 is a joke, Public Enemy. It's just you protect and serve. I want to move us to just another one that I think has folks a little bit scared right now in terms of voting rights, and it's this Save America Act. By the way, I read that there was a Democrat who supported this.
Yeah.
What is this all about, and should we be concerned?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was John Fetterman from Pennsylvania who like over the course of the last year or so has moved steadily to the right. I mean, he's really filling the role that if listeners remember, Joe Manchin from West Virginia was sort of, or Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. They were two Democrats who tended to vote with Republicans more often than not to sort of like buck the trend and buck the party and that kind of a thing. And those people have existed forever. And Fetterman is sort of filling that role now. So there are technically two of these voting rights bills, or you'll hear them called voter reform bills, but they're voter ID bills. And one is the Save America Act, which is a re-upping with a couple tweaks and changes of the Save Act that was actually passed by Congress twice already. It just never made it through the Senate. The other one is called the MEGA Act, which is Make Elections Great Again Act. That one is in the House. It hasn't left yet. It likely won't leave because the Save America Act is likely dead on arrival in the Senate. Likely. What is in the Save America Act is voter ID requirements, specifically your citizenship. You have to show proof of citizenship when you go to register to vote. The MEGA Act would require that to be done as well as when you go to the polls. And those proof of citizenships have to be Real ID compliant. The problem with that is that while the bill itself says that would be your birth certificate, a naturalization document, an adoption document, a military ID, a tribal ID, those are not Real ID compliant. So the only things that are Real IDs or a passport. Only about half of Americans have a passport. Only about half of the IDs issued in the United States right now are Real IDs, even though this has been a law since 2005. But states have been slow to adopt this. Every state has adopted this now. It doesn't mean that everyone's got a Real ID, and doesn't mean that everyone's going to get one. And this is all being done under the guise of that non-citizens and undocumented people are uh, voting in droves, and that they're actually being flown in or trucked in or bussed in by Democrats to steal elections. And that's the spectrum of this. It's either like this is rampant fraud, or it's, a conspiracy. And the conspiracy leans into some real white nationalist conspiracy theories, one called the Great Replacement Theory, which is the idea that liberals, or more often Jewish people, which you'll hear called globalists, have been doing this to replace God-fearing, white Christian American voters, which this has been the thing that has been said about every group of immigrants going back to the 1800s, when the Irish and Italians came over and weren't considered white. So, know that this is very, very old and not new and has never been real. The other thing here is that non-citizens aren't voting. They're barely registering to vote. When the ACLU was able to look at USCIS data, which is Immigration Services data, they found that of the people who registered to vote in the last election, so up to 2025, 0.04% were non-citizens, which is an insanely low number of people. And like I said this in the show this week too, that yes, there are people who will say that even one person is too many. And sure, yeah. But also, more often than not, and it's really most of the time, people who commit voter fraud, non-citizens and citizens, aren't doing it nefariously to steal an election or undermine your specific vote. It's an accident. Non-citizens who register to vote think they can register to vote and just can't, but they fall through the cracks because these things happen. Or what happens really frequently is that they are citizens. They're recently naturalized, and they got their papers, and then they wait a couple days, and then they go to their local clerk's office. They register to vote. They can because they've got the papers. Congratulations, you're an American. Aren't you excited to vote? Except for those things haven't hit the system yet, nationally. And so then you get this weird thing where that's a non-citizen registered to vote. Almost never the case. Voter fraud in general is infinitesimally small. I did the numbers on this, and I looked this up before we talked because I wanted to make sure I got these right. But when you look at the Heritage Foundation's numbers, which the Heritage Foundation is the super conservative far-right think tank that wrote Project 2025, they've got one of the best voter fraud trackers in the country that everyone uses, left and right. It's the best place to go. Even though the Heritage Foundation is a huge voter ID proponent, their numbers just don't back it up. They don't back up a need for it. I mean, from 1982 to today, there have been 1,620 proven voter fraud cases. And that includes criminal and civil and fine infractions and those things. As a matter of course, when you look between 1984 and 2024, just presidential elections, so on either side of this thing, I'm giving them back 4 years, it's 1.3 billion votes, not including midterm elections or state elections or special elections or any other time people vote. 1620 out of 1.3 billion is 12 millionths of a percent. Even if you took all of those proven fraudulent votes and put them into one single presidential election, it would not make up for anything. It wouldn't have swayed any election. It wouldn't have done anything. So voter ID or voter fraud in any capacity just isn't a problem. And what this law and then the MEGA Act, which does all the citizenship stuff, plus gets rid of universal mail-in voting, which is extremely popular, which is when you get sent an application in the mail from your Secretary of State's office to sign up to vote by mail, and then you register to vote, and you could just do that, and then you'll get your ballot a few weeks later in the mail, fill it out, send it in, you voted. They want to get rid of that because they think it's rife with fraud. It's not. It's not as low as the total number of fraud cases, but it's still 100,000ths of a percent of all mail-in voting is fraudulent. And again, that ends up being people who forgot they voted by mail and then went to vote in person. Or really frequently, it is a parent who votes by mail for their kid who's at college. Or just as frequently, it is somebody who recently lost a loved one and filled out their ballot, after they had died and said, well, they would have wanted to vote this way. And like, I'm sure they would have, but that's fraud. And, but again, it's not nefarious, right? It's not like I'm filling out thousands of ballots to then stuff them in a ballot box and game the vote. That's just not happening. The real reason for voter ID is that it prevents people from voting, because a lot of people don't have identification. They don't have ready access to things like their proof of citizenship documents, because they don't live at home, because they're in safe deposit boxes, or they're just lost. And we're talking millions of people, like 21 million people, just don't have access to these documents. I was one of them. My wife was one of them. I lost my original birth certificate in a flood when I was a kid. And then when I was trying to get a marriage license, I had to figure out how to get a reprinted original and not just the copy. Even though the copy had worked every other time, it didn't work this time. My wife, none of her documents matched because the original one from Texas hadn't quite worked. And so they had this weird cobbled together thing that worked in Oklahoma. She's from Tulsa. And so it's not like, we're from some other state or something. And like that was a nightmare process. And we're people who are have things together. We're just regular people. It also, these voter ID laws mean that so many people won't get to vote who are women, because women will, 90% of women who change their marital status also change their last names, whether it's getting married or getting divorced. It is poor people because they can't afford to buy a passport or get a new ID. It is people of color, because people of color tend to work jobs that don't let them get off work to go register to vote in person. And then it's students who don't have ready access to their citizenship documents and don't have money to get a new ID or can register to vote or any of those things. So they're disenfranchised. And we know this has happened because in Kansas in 2011, basically an identical bill to the Save America Act passes. 7 years later, it's struck down as unconstitutional because they did not find any non-citizen voting in the state of Kansas. They did find that about 12% of the people who were supposed to vote in those elections those years were barred from voting. And this is kind of the point of voter ID, because all those people I just mentioned tend to vote for Democrats.
Right. And it impacts women and people of color, which is absolutely the route that the president often takes.
Right.
I wanted to note, you really hit on something with when women get married and the change of the last name. That's happened to my wife too.
Yeah.
It was just a pain in the neck. And by the way, my real gripe with birth certificates is that they're frail pieces of paper. Do I have I think mine is in our fire safe, but I don't know. Why hasn't an entrepreneur come up with a digital or some way that's much more efficient to account for what would be on a birth certificate? This seems like $1 million idea. Why should we have stupid pieces of paper?
Why can't it be laminated? Why in every state that I've ever lived in, and I've lived in a few, why can't my birth certificate or my social security card be laminated? It's the same card. Have it at the clerk's office, at the DMV, you laminate it. And then you notarize stamp it or whatever on the outside. Fine. But I 100% agree that why is it that our basement floods when I'm 9 and I lose this thing forever because it disintegrates in the water?
And who's picking the stock of paper? Because what is this? I remember Bibles will have India paper.
Yeah.
What even that is tougher than the material that's used for birth certificates.
I know.
Mine is it's like an old crumpled dollar bill. It's torn halfway.
Yeah, I know. Mine was like that too. And it's I think it's over here somewhere in our little safe, but it was just it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for so many people. And the thing I wanted to say too is that, states could, or the federal government could, take all this effort and all this money that they would be spending and put it into, if they really wanted this, into free voting IDs that meet this criteria. If you really wanted voter ID, and you send it out to everybody. It's not going to get to everybody because we know that we have problems with people's addresses, with homeless people. Those things are difficult. But you make it easier to register to vote. You make it easier for agencies to talk to one another, for states and agencies to talk to one another so that we don't have these slip-ups with these things. You make it much, much easier for people to track their votes so they know where they are. And then you make it easier for on the front, on the this is called back end security, but you make it on the back end, which means you put the burden on the state. So like, let's say I mail my vote in, March or whatever, or let's say October, right? October 1st, mail it in for the midterms. And then I'm like, oh, it's election day. I'm going to go vote. And somebody looks it up and they can say, you've already voted. And then there's a process for that too. Some states do that. And it's like, if you didn't vote, then like, oh, we got a problem. But like, you've already voted. Do you remember voting? This is how we tracked it. This is when you sent it in. All those things. Like, those could happen. If they were really worried about election security, they could do that. They're just not doing that because that's not the actual goal of what these bills do. And I think it does a disservice to voters to talk about these bills like voting reform, or that it is, improving the voting system by imposing voter ID, even if voter ID, the idea of it, is an 80-20 issue. People like the idea of voter ID. They just don't understand the consequences. It's the equivalent of passing a law that says every time you walk into a dive bar, you've got to light up a cigarette. And like, people are like, well, I like smoking. That's great. And and it's like, right, but the consequences of that is everyone here gets cancer. And that's voter ID. Is like, yes, everyone likes this idea, but it's bad for people in the long run.
Right.
Yeah.
But voter suppression is as old as time, and this is just
Sure
the
is.
latest effort. So this week, I know that you had an episode where you talk a lot about Save America Act. What else do you have going on this week, maybe next week? Tease ahead.
Sure. So the civics lesson that I did this week for the Things You Forgot from Civics Class newsletter, which drops on Mondays, that was all about the job of the vice president. Because J.D. Vance was in the news again because he got booed at the Winter Olympics opening ceremonies, and not just in Milan, but also in Cortina. But it got me thinking about, like, what does the vice president actually do? Because there's the very famous quote from a former vice president, FDR, Texas Jack, or Cactus Jack was his name, who said that the vice presidency isn't worth a warm bucket of spit because it's like the least revered position in Congress or in Washington. And some of that's true, some of that's not. But like, I go through what that is. The Wednesday article I had this week, I really enjoyed writing. It's along the same lines of the SAVE Act, but I talked to a lot of election experts and election officials about what the Trump administration has been trying to do to get the federal government to interfere in how states run their elections. And up and down, almost everybody I talked to said this idea is doomed. Probably. It's probably going to fail. It's almost impossible to meddle with elections on this scale in the way they're trying to do it in general. But it could sow chaos, and that's the problem. But it was just a fascinating article, and also one that I found kind of buoyed me and reminded me that the people who run our elections are patriots. They are people who care about these things. They care about you. They care about their communities because they often are those same people. A lot of them are volunteers. A lot of them are doing these things under extreme stress and sometimes threats to their families and their own lives. And they still manage to turn out safe and secure elections time and time and time again. And these people need our support. And it was one of those articles that like feels bad as a topic, but in the end feels good. So do that. And then my interview today is with a fantastic a guy named Eric Zuleger, who is a foreign policy guy. My show's not a lot about foreign policy. The show here is not a lot about foreign policy. I don't dabble in it much. It's not my wheelhouse, but it is Eric's. And we talk about what's happening in Iran, what's happening in Greenland. He's an intelligence guy. So we talk about that sort of FAA Texas thing that happened this week. And so what I said earlier was kind of borrowing a lot from that conversation. And then he's got a amazing new podcast called The Under Report that is fantastic. So I'm so excited to put that out today as well because it's just good. And then I'm also launching a new newsletter on Sunday this week. I know. As if I don't have enough on my plate, right? It's called Make It Make Nonsense. And so it is the opposite of what you get from me every week. It is the stuff that I have been thinking about that has nothing to do with politics. The stuff that's up here behind me that's like, I'll probably throw some D&D stuff in here. I'll probably throw some Star Wars stuff in there. This week, I kind of want to talk about the people who make the Olympic Games ready to be Olympic Games. I don't know if you've seen the guys who like pebble, it's what it's called. They pebble the curling sheet. And they'd have to like moonwalk their way down by like spraying water back and forth. It's like the special water to like make the rocks slide. I don't know. It's amazing. And it's like 3 dudes. And then like the people who sheet the super pipe for the snowboarders. I find this stuff endlessly fascinating. And they're also just as passionate about these things as the athletes. And so there's something like kind of adorable in a water boy sort of way about them. But like, I want this newsletter to be a place where you can go and like, what's keeping me sane, it hopefully will help keep you sane a little bit. So that's on Sunday.
But will there be any Bad Bunny in your first edition?
Ooh, I mean, there definitely might be because I really enjoyed the halftime show.
I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
And like got a little verklempt at, near the end there when it was
the God Bless America.
Yes. And like I speak a little Spanish, so like I follow a lot of it, but like I liked his music before, and it was just very fun and full of joy. And I know that there's a lot of uproar about this or that about his thing, but like it felt really like what a halftime show at the NFL should be, which was just a party, and it just felt like fun. Apart from the fact that the game wasn't the best in the world.
Right. I think that Kendrick walked so that Bad Bunny could run, and both of them. I think that the Super Bowl halftime show is going to evolve into more of art performance theater. It's no longer just going to be a band playing. I mean, mind you, the Super Bowl used to be up with people and random high school cheerleader, college cheerleaders.
Yeah.
Oh, they're awesome and everything. The 1958 NFL, AFL, there was no AFL, is the NFL championship in 58. I think that was the year that the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants played. Very famous game.
Yeah.
It was like a cheerleading troop. Awesome, but that wasn't Michael Jackson in 1993, and that was definitely not Bad Bunny. I minored in Spanish, but I didn't minor in Puerto Rican.
I mean, it's different.
It's different. Nueva York is Nueva Yol, but I will tell you, his song DTMF, which by the way would make you think, oh, that sounds like a Prince title.
Yeah.
There was a song like that from Prince a long time ago, much different meaning. I believe it's like Debian más fotos. You should take more photos. And it is the sweetest. It actually is. There's a short film on YouTube that tells the story. I'm like, it was the best of America watching him out there. And I'm sorry that so many people can't grasp that.
I like a part of me in hearing the people talk about that, specifically someone like Megyn Kelly, who like really went on a tirade about it. It made me sad for them that they watched that and they were filled with so much rage at it. Because it was, like I said, it was so full of joy. It was certainly my favorite halftime show since Prince.
Right. Same.
And like, but wildly different, right? Prince was just this scale and like a wall of talent that he was. Not that Bad Bunny is not talented, because it was clearly full of talent, but like that was a spectacle of like magnitude. Well, it's like Bad Bunny's thing was, it felt inclusive by making the inclusivity circle bigger, and that was clearly his intent. And I think for the people who felt excluded, I don't know why that didn't land for them. It just feels so bizarre because there wasn't a moment of that halftime performance that I wasn't smiling, and also where I was only catching every 7th word. Like it was that.
No, totally. I should note, I'm a Prince guy. I own most of his albums on CD, and I go back all the way to the beginning. I think he's the most talented guy in the modern rock era. Period. Full stop. But it's different here, and I think that there's a lot of things on TikTok and YouTube where you see people, Puerto Ricans in a Miami Walmart stopping to watch this. People in Dominican Republic, in Nicaragua, stopping to watch this as either a town square or in a big house. That has never happened.
We have friends who are from a big Puerto Rican family here in Detroit, and we didn't get to watch the game with them, but they sent us videos because it was our friend with his whole family who were from Puerto Rico originally, and it was their daughter and his mom, so grandma and granddaughter, sitting together, and like grandma's just weeping, just openly crying and like dancing, but like it was emotional for a lot of people, for Puerto Ricans to be recognized on this stage as true Americans because they are. And I don't know, it was a celebration of yes, Puerto Rican heritage and yes, Latino heritage, but also of America itself and what we can do when we can bring people together. And like I said, for the people who didn't get that from this, like it makes me sad for them. I pity them for that. Yeah.
Agree. That's a good note to end on. Folks, you can find Grant at Make It Make Sense with Grant Hermes. Mims Pod, that's where we do that, and I'm going to make sure and note Make It Make Nonsense in the show notes. For Grant, I'm Ryan, the Oklahoma Memo Podcast. We will talk to you next week.